Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ming. Today I'll talk about is the definition of disability for CPPD and ODSP inclusive. The definition of disability forms the foundation of disability benefit programs in determining the scope of program coverage and the eligibility criteria of qualified recipients. The definition of disability varies across Canada along with the separation of powers of the federal and provincial governments. This paper centralizes on the disability eligibility criterion set by the Canada Pension Plan, Disability Benefit, and the Ontario Disability Support Program. The CPPD differs from the ODSP in significant ways in which it functions as a social insurance plan administered by the federal government, while the ODSP is a social assistance program managed by the provincial government. The provincial government's proposed reform in 2018 has made the comparison possible. In 2018, the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services of Ontario announced its reform objective to reframe ODSP definition of disability so that it lines up with the federal government's regulation. And the proposed changes have stirred a backlash from politicians, caused anger and confusion within the disabled population. Legal professionals argue that ODSP redefinition of disability would follow CPPD's framework and foreshadow that such adjustment would result in a more stringent eligibility standard. CPPD benefit stipulates that the recipient must be under 65 and has made substantial payments into the pension plan within a specific window of time. A disability must satisfy two components simultaneously. A, the medical condition is predicted to be long-lasting. B, such long-lasting condition directly prohibits the individual from committing to any type of substantially gainful work. In comparison to CPPD, ODSP's definition of disability is more inclusive. It expands to shelter individuals who suffer from episodic mental and or physical disability with an expected period of a year and above. And similarly, this disability must negatively influence one's capacity to work. However, the definition includes one's capacity to look after oneself and one's community involvement. The applicant must meet the financial threshold for eligibility and provide medical evidence issued by certified healthcare personnel. In essence, ODSP definition of disability is founded on the economic model to which the medical model is implicitly subordinate. According to the federal guidelines, the definition of disability encompasses persistent, short-lived, and episodic medical conditions. Due to the complex nature of disability heightened by the intersectionality of body, mind, and society, a uniform definition of disability is not adopted in federal programs. The federal guidelines of disability outlined in the medical model and the social model in explaining disability, and noticeably, the economic model and the socio-political model were not mentioned. So my argument was using Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence. The paper shed light on how the definition of disability and its complications have often been overlooked and rendered normal. My paper focuses on 4 models of disability. The conceptualization of disability gains legitimacy from theoretical models. Historically, the medical model underlines that the fault lies within the autistic individual for possessing an undesirable attribute. And such a model views the movement to institutionalize individuals and strip them of rights to consent to experiments and treatments, and formulates a binary division between normal and abnormal. While the economic model stresses economic independence of citizens, the social model regards societal barriers as underlining obstacles to full participation of the disabled population. And lastly, the socio-political model adds on to the social model, shifts the blame from the disabled person to the external environment comprised of societal attitudes, legal and state practices. This model questions the validity of individuality emphasized in the medical and economic model. Bourdieu's constructivist structuralism theorizes that social classes hold different schemes which formulate agents' sense of one's place, in which decisions are made based on practicality. Symbolic violence is actualized as agents conform to the schemes of classification without awareness that social conditioning has shaped their habitats. I've conducted 2 rounds of interviews, averaged 45 to 60 minutes with 4 autistic self-advocates with lived experience in CPPD and or ODSP, and 2 have been involved in disability policy public consultation provincially and in federal disability policymaking. Data collection is still ongoing, and participants shared their perspectives on the definition of disability represented in CPPD and ODSP, their views on the eligibility standard, and opinions on the bigger picture of disability policymaking in Ontario. So the central theme derived from the interviews points to the implicit policy attitude enforced by the Ontario's government. The political will was to actualize less government rather than, quote, supporting people with disability with dignity, quote, as cited in the ministry's public announcement. Although the minister has denied that the reform has to do with financial expenses, participants perceive that the reform was about money. Ironically, participants argue that CPPD and ODSP are not about disability and that their definition of disability were not implemented under consideration for disability. The eligibility standard reduces the human to a non-human, identified by quantifiable components that support resource allocation decisions. Labeling the disabled applicant as less abled strengthens the medical model's pathological orientation and promotes ableism. In essence, ODSP redefinition of disability is set to divide applicants who can work and those who cannot work. It motivates a hierarchy of disability in which future applicants who suffer from episodic or temporary disabilities will not be considered as disabled. Participants argue that the attempted redefinition of ODSP was in the Conservative Party's interest of passing the buck and to place the responsibility on the Liberal Party. Policy concerning children are often perceived to be more marketable to the public, as children are not expected by societal norms to earn living to support themselves. And in order to combat the dominant discourse that disabled recipients are lazy and reluctant to work, participants argue that they've always marketed on their willingness and enthusiasm for employment. They believe that such an approach will fit into the dominant discourse so that their voices could be heard. The medical model cultivates the notion that disability is a personal tragedy, and hence it is not the state responsibility to share the cost. Equally, the economic model only deems a disabled individual worthy if the individual contributes to the labor system. In determining deserving from undeserving citizens, Aristotle's notion of justice entails that one's entitlement depends on what one deserves. The dominant discourse enforced by the governments promote the ideology that disabled individuals only deserve to apply for CPPD under the condition that they have made sufficient investment into the social pension plan. In parallel, dignity would only be restored to the disabled recipient on ODSP if the recipient is employed. As a result, bureaucrats and policymaking delegates might perceive that CPPD and ODSP framework as legitimate. Bourdieu's proceeds that as the delegates embrace the political ideology, they could demonstrate little empathy as their distance from the agents excluded from the field. The language employed would therefore be judged as legitimate. So here I have some quotes from my participants. The reproduction of symbolic violence across generation is captured in the government's language in order to be included into the field to fight for a form of capital. Autistic adults must abide to the structured spaces enforced upon them. Participants argue that being white, being verbal, and having a certain degree of education have enabled them to have a seat at the table. And knowing how groups and classes communicate, mimicking their articulatory style, allowed some participants to interact more effectively with authorities. In order to be considered as a valid voice at the table in policymaking, some participants have to sacrifice by masking and adapting to the ways of the dominant culture. And here are some more quotes. And for example, Mason said, attitude towards disability in general. Being disabled is not a bad thing, it's challenging. Cultural, historical taboo, they still exist, just a different form, whether disabled people should have a right to do things for themselves. That attitude still exists. In my lifetime, I experienced institutionalization because of this. And my references.
Hi, so my talk today is sort of examining new public management principles and practices in universities and examining its tensions with anti-racism work and social justice work. But for the sake of time, I'm going to focus specifically on anti-racism. So the first thing I want to address is that I know that in the early 2000s, there were a lot of discussions around whether NPM still existed and whether it was still relevant. I just wanted to make a note here that, and I like Paulette's quote here from 2016, sort of likening new public management as sort of like a layering and marbling in its placement, and that it isn't dead, as Dunleavy would have stated in that 2006 article. And Hood, one of the PA scholars that talks about NPM and coined the term, also called it middle-aged and sort of paradoxical. But I think Paulette sort of observes here that it sort of has just sort of meshed into whatever location it's at, and it's become a taken for granted structure. So I think it's very relevant to talk about it today, and how it interacts with, or how it sort of, what it manifests or influences in anti-racism work. So just to give a quick background, like I'm pulling on Hood and Dunleavy's work where they identify, and these are just sort of like general terms, or sort of easy to see, which a lot of professional management of staff, management practices informed by the private sector, creating standards of practice, measurement of performance, emphasis on outputs rather than inputs. So that means looking at the end result and not so much investing so much time or resources on the inputs. Decentralization and reduction of bureaucratic structures, which creates competition for contracting and so forth. And I'll be contrasting that with critical race theory, because as anti-racism work is really rooted in that area. And so I'm sort of drawing on the tenets here that Delgado and Stefancic has outlined, and that racism is endemic in our society. So it's present, it's there, we have to acknowledge it. Racism advances the interest of white elites materially, in a material way, and of whites who aren't privileged in a sort of psychically way. And race is socially constructed. Each person has their own history, identities, so intersectionality. And then finally, racialized voices need to be valued, as they historically have not been in research, in literature, in every facet of our society. So just a quick background leading up to my comparison. Canadian universities and so NPM and equity work, like how does that kind of work in? Well, in Canadian universities, there's a lot going on. So in the 70s and 60s, there were a lot of protests from unions and women's group regarding employment equity. But going back to the 1970s, Boyko and Jones noted that there was like this more scholar for the dollar dictum that began to rise. And then, of course, the Employment Equity Act came in with a report by Justice Abella in 1986, and it identified women, racialized people and groups, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous and First Nations people as a needed group in employment equity. And then as we head into the mid-1990s, Mike Harris, a progressive a progressive conservative government comes in and sort of emphasizes this idea of accountability. I was a teenager at that time, so I remember very much so all the strikes and all the changes during that time, which very much shifted the way teachers or funding, how it was distributed, and how organizations were running. Whoops, missing one here, sorry. And then the Employment Equity Act was amended in 1996 to include the public sector. And then around, and of course, like a lot of stuff in between, but one of the more important movements recently has been the contemporary social movements of Black Lives Matter, Truth and Reconciliation, to name a few, that sort of spurred on a lot of statements, organizational policies, commitments from organizations. And I just want to emphasize these are just written statements and written texts and things in strategic plans, not necessarily action. And then there's rising interest, of course, in performance-based funding, to contrast that with indicators heavily focused on the labor market. And so in 2020, the Ford government in Ontario, as an example, sort of is pushing for that. I think there was a delay because of the pandemic, but hoping that they would like to move forward with that. So this is sort of the comparison that I'm sort of looking at. So I'm sort of exploring how these sort of features of NPM, New Public Management, that exist and examples in the context of Canadian universities sort of interact with that, and then how it works, or how it works against with critical race theory or anti-racism work. So for the first, I have, whoops, sorry, there you go. So professional management of public sector employees. We see a lot of like lack of representation in leadership. Kukie et al. Recently found that only 86.68% of leaders, 86.68% of leaders were white, and the rest were either Black, a person of color, or in an other category, so unidentified. And this is an example of how today, that despite this sort of professional management and employment equity work being done, voices of color are still being ignored and excluded in these important decision-making roles. And if we look at Wingfield and Alston's work on racialized tasks, these kind of produce sort of or reproduce whiteness, kind of culture of whiteness, where people who are white are usually at the top, determining the culture and reproducing the ideal, which is whiteness. And then sort of, as you go down the level, more and more racialized people fall into the lower level positions that have a lack of power. The second piece is the management practices informed by the private sector and NPM. So in the private sector, a lot of strategic planning, risk assessments, all of those kind of tools and instruments being used sort of have kind of turned into this performative allyship and anti-racism language co-option. So using things like EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, it becomes sort of like a language that exists in strategic documents, but in practice, it is not being done. And Tamtik and Gunter studied this in policies put out by universities and identified that a lot of the language was either inconsistent across Canadian universities, or when they were existing, they were this sort of mild form of EDI work that didn't actually look at the culture of the organization, but more about student recruitment or things that related to supporting more fun, like money coming into the organization. So racism as endemic in this piece, as going into the third column, is one of those. And also I would say material determinism, which I've forgot to add as well, but that we have to, in order to acknowledge, or in order to address racism, we have to acknowledge that it exists, not simply in a document, but to enact it and put action to it, which is part of the whole CRT, critical race theory, like idea, like we have to put action to addressing racism, not merely sort of a performance or a document. So another NPM item is standards of practice. An example is James and Chapman Yao did a study and found that whiteness in like performance reviews and job hirings, that was really idealized. So for example, they interviewed people on hiring committees, and they found that a lot of people on these hiring committees would say, well, I don't want, we don't want somebody with an accent. None of the students will understand them. Or they'll see foreign credentials as being lesser than credentials from their own country or the US, Canada, and UK specifically. So this, again, upholding of whiteness. And so this comes into contrast with the critical race theory tenet of intersectionality and race as a social construction, and that these kind of practices, these standards of practice that policies and practices that we try to do to make our work easier or to make things fair, quote unquote, is actually not acknowledging the complexity of identity and experience. And the other NPM piece is measurement of performance. This is a big thing for me, meritocracy and bias. Really sort of inferiorize and devalue the work of racialized faculty. Henry et al. Did a study and found that racialized faculty were being promoted at slower rates than their white faculty, despite taking on like heavy amount of workloads, including service. And I'll talk about cultural taxation next, but sort of doing a lot of like EDI work on top of the other work that they do, simply because they're racialized. And so when we compare this to the critical race theory tenets, voices of color here are not being valued because the measurement of performance is sort of rooted in whiteness and the racism that exists in our society or in organizations is not acknowledged. So again, like employment equity and all these policies are not doing anything in action. And emphasis on outputs rather than inputs. So looking and that NPM practice means that you're looking at the end result and not so much the process. Here, cultural taxation is a perfect example. When you're a person of color, you're typically put on EDI committees, anti-racism committees. You are the voice of diverse perspectives on several different committees outside of EDI and anti-racism committees. And Wajinska and Ramos did a study and found that there was a lot of workload inequity that caused burnout for racialized faculty who had to take on all this extra work, but it wasn't acknowledged because service in this sense and in academia is considered not held to the standard of publication. So even though they're putting in so much extra time and they're creating all these outputs, their time being used, all that input is being ignored, and only their outputs are being acknowledged. So this is material determinism where racialized bodies and time are being used and abused in this sense in the organization. And then the decentralization, reduction of bureaucratic structures and use of contracts. Of course, we know precarious labor is a huge issue, and COUT did a report in 2018 on how the experiences of university teaching and contracting out of it. And a lot of racialized women were identified as having very short, higher rates of short contracts, less than a year, not full time. So they're not only being diminished in their power and in how they can speak out to these problems, but their bodies, their time, again, the disadvantages that they have, or the disadvantages that are not being addressed, the inequity there in the organization. Sorry, 1 minute left. I knew this was going to be a problem. I'm so sorry, everyone. Okay, so I wanted to, perfect. I think I'm at the end.
Right. So hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to present today my research, which actually looks at the influence of public policies, work incentives on older workers in Quebec. So my population, well, I'm interested in seniors or older workers. I'm gonna probably name them both. And usually I'm looking at people 55 years of age or older, but sometimes I'm more interested in subgroups of that population, and I will specify it during the presentation if needed. So faced with an aging population, supranational organizations like OECD, World Bank, EMF, IMF, or European Commission actually came forward with the concept of active aging, which is quite of an ambitious perspective, which implies that in exchange for the capacity for lifelong learning and a protection of abilities, individuals like seniors have the duty to remain socially active in order to benefit the community and his own interest. So actually, it's quite of a large perspective. It not only means that they have to stay active in the labor market, but also like by, for example, volunteering or helping their child or anything. But actually, many European countries, and Quebec is included, have adopted that concept, active aging, in their communications, but concrete policies have mostly consisted of incentives to work and to regulate the labor market. And for example, over the past 10 years, Quebec has put in place various measures to stimulate the participation of older workers in the labor market. Like it started with in 2012, when they put in place a tax credit on the supply side, so on the workers, to make the working more interesting financially. Then 1 year later, they actually implemented a wage subsidy for companies, so it could be more interested to recruit older workers because they have a like discrimination, ageism on those people. 1 year later, they actually reformed the Quebec pension plans, as well as actually the rest of Canada made a similar reform where you can benefit from rents, from the pension, from the program, and work at the same time, which you could not do before 2014. And then 2 years earlier, they actually introduced a tax credit for small and medium enterprise with a similar objective than the wage subsidy. To me, this seems to be like two main reasons why Quebec is so proactive in this action. Quebec is actually the only province which has so much programs to induce seniors to go back to work or to remain in the labor market. And the first reason why is usually the potential adverse effects of an aging population, especially labor shortages and the pressures on public finances, especially on the health systems and on the public pension plans. But actually, Quebec also has a gap in activity of seniors compared to the rest of Canada. As you can see on this graph, on the whole period, Quebec has a lower participation rate of people aged 55 and over, like during the whole period. But the thing that is interesting in this figure, I think, is that you see the tendencies are quite specific. At the start of the period, it goes down until the mid-90s or something. Then it goes up again quite steadily till 2020. So there are a lot of factors driving this participation rate, like life expectancy that are rising, the level of education as well. But I think the most striking thing is like more than half of the seniors are actually working because of necessities, because of financial needs, based on surveys of Statistic Canada. So as you can see, here on this graphic, you can see the low income among seniors, measures by the low income measures after tax. You see they are quite of the same tendencies than the labor force participation rate. At first, it's quite high, and it goes down until the mid-90s. Then it goes up again from the mid-90s to the end of the period. So to me, it's quite of an important thing, and it's never approached in the political discourse narrative. About the work intensive, the public policies, it's actually very interesting work, I think, because previously, in the context of high unemployment, public policies or institutional arrangements were primarily designed to induce older workers to retire and leave their jobs to younger workers so the unemployment could go down. But actually, with the aging of the population and the emergence of labor shortages, the government had to adjust their incentives to actually stimulate the participation of seniors in the labor market. So we don't really know about the efficiencies of those measures because it's pretty recent. And actually, to the best of my knowledge, there has only been 2 scientific works that have studied tax measures for older workers, one in Sweden and the other one in Australia. Actually, those 2 studies came to a similar conclusion. That it's not that effective in stimulating the participation of older workers to the labor market. So based on that, my main research questions in my thesis and an article is that, well, I wonder if the measures in Quebec have achieved their objective of stimulating the participation of older workers. And I wonder also if there has been interactions between those measures. The most important point for me is also to look at the differentiated effect of those measures according to socio-demographic characteristics like age, sex, level of education, and status, immigration status. And lastly, my last main research question is like, I wonder if this intensification of work that we see in recent years is more the result of a free and voluntary choices, or is it more constrained by financial needs? It's usually the 2 perspectives that are opposed between each other. So in methodological terms, I'm more of a quantitative researcher. I'm using the difference in difference method with Quebec as the treatment group and Ontario as the control group. If you have a question about the methodology, I'll be happy to answer after, so I don't take too much time. And I'm using the labor force survey data, microdata from Statistics Canada. So it's kind of a huge pool of observations, around 2 million of people in my database, of people age 55 and over in Ontario and Quebec. So I have results and preliminary results because the results are based on an article that will be published in December in the Canadian Public Policy Journal. Where I looked at the career extension tax credit, so the tax credit that has been put in place in 2012. And I found that these policies had a positive and significant effect on the possibility of employment and activity for most age and sex subgroups of workers age 60 and over. So it's actually very efficient when you compare to the one of Sweden and Australia. We found that a little less than 27,000 jobs per year have been created since 2012 for an average annual cost of roughly 5,000 jobs, $5,000 per job. So it's quite efficient. And the preliminary results are based on my thesis that is currently being written or so. And I have 3 main findings. First is that the effectiveness of the incentives to work first may represent an intensification of the commodification of seniors, and especially those with low level of education or that are more precarious. Second, that the unemployment rate is also significantly correlated with the implementation of those public policies, and especially for the oldest age group of workers. And lastly, that those measures, the measures aimed at the supply side, seems more effective than those aimed at the demand. So people, the workers, seems to respond a lot more than companies. So I draw 2 main conclusions from those results. First, the responsibility for the financial health of retirees is shifted primarily on the shoulders of workers instead of governments or companies. And second, it seems to have a form of ageism that could exist in the labor market. So that's why we could see the unemployment rate rising or being significantly correlated with the implementation of those public policies. So as you see, my article especially was based on the efficiencies of those public policies. But I think the important discussion should also be on normative aspects. Like, as you can see, the arguments being put forward by the government in Quebec is usually around economic regulation, regulation of the labor market. But I believe that my subject is quite a good opportunity to interrogate the legitimacy of those public policies and the free choice work, precariousness of workers, and especially the centrality of work in the life course of people. Because, well, to me, my vision of economy is more that the economy should help people's lives and not the other way around. And actually, the narrative of Quebec's government is actually the other way around. They don't really much care about which kind of work people are induced to take and to remain in the labor market, and not really the quality of that work. And so that's why I want to discuss this in my research. And that's that.